It is time to go deeper in God's Word. It's time to engage in truth. Here is Dr. Steve Ford and Pastor John Bornschein.
You're listening to Engage in Truth, and we are so happy that you've joined us today. This is Steve Ford, your co-host, along with Pastor John Bornschein, Senior Pastor at Calvary Fellowship Fountain Valley here in Colorado Springs, Colorado. Last episode, we had originally planned to continue our series on the history of the Bible. Those of you who heard it know that instead it was a wonderful show combining both an update on world events and a call to draw close to God and trust Him in these tumultuous times. During our last episode on the history of the Bible, we ended with why our book of Holy Scripture is called the Bible, how it got its name. On today's show, we have much more to discuss about how the Bible became the book containing God's holy words. Let's get started. Pastor John?
No, thank you, Dr. Ford. It's so good to be back with you. We did have a lot of fun last week. I mean, when I say fun, it was just a wonderful off the cuff, just talking about the things that are happening in our culture today. As you mentioned, it was called Signs of the Times. And so if you missed last week's program, you can go to calvaryfountain.com, and there you'll find that program and many others, and you can share them with your friends and family alike. And as Dr. Ford just mentioned, we've been in the series about the history of the Bible. This is so important to know how the Bible came to be. So often today, the Bible is being challenged by many in academia, and they try to somehow convince people that this was the work of men, and individuals co-conspired together to frame it and form it over many generations, and that is not the case. What we find is it is the tapestry of God, and God Himself has woven our handbook, and He has put it together over a period of 1,500 years, maybe longer, depending on the age of the book of Job. And He used over 40 authors to do it. And it is a wonderful masterpiece. That's what we ought to take away from this. So I have a great love for God's holy word. And the more we have explored how it came to be, the more appreciation we should have for it, to see how God has held it together through the centuries, through the generations. And when many other texts would erode and go by the ways of time, the Bible has held together through and through and been preserved miraculously by the hands of God. So we're going to talk about that and how long scrolls last and so forth. So we're going to get into many discussion points throughout this series. But let me go back, Dr. Ford, you just mentioned, for those of you who weren't able to hear a couple weeks ago, we talked about that, how the Bible came to be by way of its name, why we call it the Bible. Let me just recap that for a moment as we continue today's discussion. The answer to that takes us back to the Latin word biblia, which is the root of the Greek word biblos, meaning book or the book. So Christians really do have a patent on the word book. The book. That's what the Bible is, after all. But actually, the name goes back to geography. If you're familiar with where Lebanon is today, there's the port of Byblos, and this is the location where the Egyptians would export papyrus up to Greece, specifically to a town called Pergamus. Now, it's a city known by three different names: Pergamus, Pergamum, or Pergamon. And it used to be the place where basically the scrolls were not only recorded, but also kept. One of the largest libraries in the world will be there at Pergamus. And so papyrus was a tall reed plant. It grew along the Nile River in Egypt, and it was even the very material used to make the basket for Moses, to put Moses in there in the Nile River. And papyrus was also known as wicker. Well, the city of Pergamus is where the book would ultimately be developed. We'll talk about that today. It became this precursor to the modern era book, all formed there in that city of Pergamus. And it's worth mentioning that Pergamus had one of these largest libraries. Alexandria, Egypt was the most populous by way of scrolls. So these two libraries competed to be the largest in the world. So the port of Byblos there in Lebanon was the connection point. This papyrus would ultimately be shipped through that port in Lebanon all the way up to Pergamus. So that's why it became such a profound, this became the port in the world where all of this material was shipped through, and it therefore connected Alexandria, Egypt, one of the largest exporters of papyrus, to Pergamus, the manufacturer of scrolls, and ultimately the place where the book came to be. So the term Biblos is associated with the book. Now, that really, I think, leads us, Dr. Ford, to how this all came to be, right? This whole transition. That's I think, the question, what we're chomping at the bit is, how did we get from scrolls to books?
Right.
I know all of our listeners were like, yes, please tell me, how did that happen? Just a little trip down history lane here. Since the Bible was originally penned on scrolls, it was eventually compiled, transcribed, and stitched into manuscripts that were called a codex. That's what would be the precursor to the modern day book. They were bound together sheets, and they were often of vellum, is where we would see later. And those handwritten sheets, we'll talk about how that came to be. But this process of developing books came from this city, Pergamum, or Pergamon. Where is that? That is in Turkey. Modern day Bergama, Turkey, of all places. And what we find scripturally is that Turkey is like an epicenter of so much activity. In fact, when we talk about the end of days, you have to keep your eye on Turkey. They can just slip right underneath the radar.
Right.
And yet they're the point of the bridge between Europe and the Middle East. They're often the connection point, even as we see in Ezekiel 38 and 39, to what will be Gog and Magog. And this is not going to be the only time we see them referenced. I mean, outside of Israel, Turkey has a major influence on the world. It's possible that Noah's Ark came to rest there at Mount Ararat in Turkey. It's often debated about where that is, but it seems like the evidence leads to that's where that place is located, that is the true Mount Ararat. That Christians were first called Christians in Antioch, which is also in Turkey. The book of Revelation kicks off in Turkey. That's where the 7 churches were located. In fact, we say, well, those are images of the transition of time of the church age, but it's also the cities in and of themselves. That's where those churches were located. It's the seat of power that was ultimately would become for the very capital of Rome, moved to Turkey. We often think of Italy as being this place of Rome's power, and it was for the religious side. But when the empire was divided by Constantine, he made the political seat of power there in Constantinople, which is modern-day Istanbul, Turkey. And as I've mentioned already, in prophecy, we see Ezekiel 38:39, we find that it's maybe as the Antichrist called the Assyrian king of the north, that we find that in Daniel, that he may even be of the nation of Turkey or some role there, because we find that Turkey is incredibly influential over Russia, over the United Nations, over the Middle East. They seem to be a world player. So I know that's a little bunny trail down the road there, but to find that the modern book came about out of this country modern times now called Turkey. It's not even spelled that way anymore. I mean, Turkey it seems to be a place that's ever changing and ever influential. It's constantly being referenced in the news. We just need to keep our eye on it. But here we see that the modern book came about in this country called Turkey. Now, it would make its way from Pergamus over to Ephesus. And Ephesus would also be greatly involved in not only the collection of scrolls, but also in the development of the modern day book. But what we find is that if you look through history on this, scholars created a new process to try to revolutionize literature. When they would open up these scrolls and the process to go about scroll creation and keeping scrolls and trying to find information on scrolls, the codex was critical in development. They imagine, trying to unroll possibly a 35-foot long scroll to find what you were looking for. Now these sheets could be woven together into 8x10 sizes. That's where we get the modern numerical value there of 8x10s. That would be compressed and compiled into a codex. And that would ultimately be, as we would see, just their desire to make information more accessible. So they would take 160 animals after the issue of, the king in Egypt had a debate with the king in Pergamus. This created a separation of the papyrus being shipped up north. So they started to use vellum. It would take 160 animals, their skins, to create enough vellum for one complete Bible. So they started to use vellum and stretching this material, calling it parchment then as well. The construction of parchment was the scraping and stretching of animal skins, usually goat, sheep, or sometimes calf, into like paper thin sheets. And it lasted a lot longer. So it ended up enabling text to be kept for much longer. In fact, we'll see here, and we'll talk about this text, the oldest biblical compilation that's still in existence today is the Sinaiticus, and it's dated to 325 AD. So because of the move from papyrus to parchment, because of that debate between those kings, we now have texts that are dated over 1,700 years and
That's
counting.
incredible.
And we're able to hold modern translations now accountable to that because we still have these texts at our fingertips. We'll talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls as well. But because of that longevity, my goodness, look at the blessing that we have now. We now have this archive at our fingertips to hold all transcriptions accountable to. That's very important. I find it very interesting, though. In the Latin, when we're talking about these sheets that were used to make books with, it's called pergaminium because it was from Pergamum, right? So they named these sheets of paper out of these animal skins based on the city from which it came. So I've already mentioned to you that Sinaiticus became the first oldest compilation of the entire Bible. But coming back to the idea that before the Codex, and you had to unroll these scrolls, some of them were 35 feet in length. Now, just to give you an idea, the entire book of Romans was 11 and a half feet long before the Codex came to be, right? So you'd have to unroll this entire scroll. Let me give you some other examples. Mark is, before it was turned to book format, 19 feet long. John, the book of John, the gospel, 23 and a half feet long. Matthew, 30 feet long.
Wow.
And Luke and Acts, now remember, they were combined initially, same author, 32 feet long. Now, the book of Revelation, by comparison, is only 15 feet long. I say only 15 feet long. So it was so important, this transition around the 2nd century BC by the Greeks, starting to move toward the book format. And by the 1st century AD, the books were taking off. Knowledge was spreading. And now we have then these massive libraries that would be formed. Pergamus had over 200,000 scrolls and books combined in their collection. Alexandria, Egypt had over 500,000 scrolls. So these two became known as like the Google of their time. If you wanted to research, as we see with Jerome, when he wanted to research even from the Septuagint and started to translate the Bible to Latin, he had to go to Alexandria, Egypt and sit there with those scrolls and then ultimately the Codex and go through that text to be able to give us the Latin version of the Bible. So they couldn't obviously just go around the corner somewhere. They had to go to these two primary locations, Turkey and Egypt. Now, these libraries, the reason why this was happening, and we say, why did they start forming these giant libraries? Well, the reason is because the library became a way of showing off wealth and power, mainly because the heirs of Alexander the Great, when the kingdom was divided up, were trying to now show their stature. So knowledge became power. And that's why Alexandria, Egypt started to really put itself on the map as being the source of all knowledge. Now, what's interesting is there's nothing new under the sun, right? If you were to go back and look up images of what the Alexandrian library looked like, it looks almost exactly like the National Mall in Washington, D.C., where we have the Smithsonian and the obelisk. Well, you have almost the exact image for the library in Alexandria. So it's, again, nothing new under the sun.
Very true. So I do have a question, though. So with growing interest and competition to create books to fill those libraries, like you said, 3rd and 2nd centuries BC with the Greeks, and then we have the Romans by the 1st century AD, books are becoming more and more popular. So how did the biblical text remain preserved without alterations and additions as they were trying to, crank out more and more of these codices, more and more of these books?
Right. Yeah, that's a great question because obviously that they when there's a lot of push for a collection of knowledge, there was a lot of writers now at work, right? Because the more scrolls, the better. The more codexes, the better. This would indicate that they were very knowledgeable, very powerful, very wealthy, and certainly we see that in Ephesus and Pergamus alike. And trying to compete with Alexandria, how do they compete? Well, in Pergamus, they were incredibly innovative. They were taking literature, constantly trying to make it more accessible, making their library, quite frankly, at that time, like state of the art, and trying to compete in that way. But I do find it interesting that Pergamus has a bit of history. If this is the library that sort of set the standard, though they didn't have nearly as many scrolls as the Alexandrian library, they were the ones where innovation was happening on how to gather information and disseminate that information. We can expect that Satan is going to be right there, right? Any place where knowledge is changing the minds and hearts of men. And here we find that the biblical scrolls were making their way into their collections, just as we find that the original collection of the Old Testament was compiled there in Alexandria. Well, Pergamus was also doing the same. So as they had writers that were taking these biblical scrolls and putting them into their collections so that they would have the entire compilation right there at their fingertips, Satan is right there trying to deceive, trying to twist right out of the gate. In Revelation chapter 2, verses 12 to 17, we find out that Pergamus is the place where the church was reprimanded by Jesus for its compromise. It's also, we're told there that this is the place where Satan moved his throne to Pergamus, of all places, and he took with him there from Babylon. Much of the influence of Babylon moved to Pergamus as well. In fact, it became this epicenter of worship unto Zeus, Asclepius. The Acropolis was world famous there. It became known as the City of the Snake. And at this place is where 52 other writings, Greek literature, was trying to make its way into the compilation of biblical literature. So 52 other writings, just because they were old, even today, people say, well, they should be in the compilation of the Bible. Absolutely not. They're laced with error. The authors are unknown. They were originally written in Greek and not written in Hebrew when we're talking about the Old Testament compilations. There's a number of factors, and people assess these things and go, wait a minute, so just because they're old, they aren't infallible. No, there was an attempt to infiltrate the Bible with Greek philosophy even then. And so Satan was obviously trying to distort the canon before the canon was even compiled. He was relentless in this objective. And so let me just add this, Dr. Ford. I think without getting too much into a bunny trail here, but it's absolutely important that we understand this, that at the city of Pergamus, where many translations were coming about and compiling this knowledge for people to find, especially when it comes to the Bible, even though the letters were going out all across Asia Minor, because that's what happened. When the apostles were writing this, specifically Paul, he wrote 13 of the 27, because actually 14 if we add Hebrews into that equation. So he wrote, over half of the New Testament, and they were all being sent out to churches, and churches would gather and compile these, and then those letters would be transcribed, copied over and over again, and they would make their way into these massive libraries. And so as this collection was amassing there in Pergamus, what we'd find is that there were attempts right away to distort it, to change before a canon even came about, to twist and distort that canon. So God's hand of protection has been upon this ever since. It is so important that we hold all of these accountable. That's exactly what they were doing then in the first century, and that's exactly what we have to do today, because there was infiltration of Greek philosophy then, or attempts to do so, and it's even happening today. There's a lot of motivation to try to release new biblical translations, because as soon as publishers do, it becomes the bestseller. Right? So because they know that they're handling the bestseller of the world. And so any new variations of that, well, now we've got another bestseller on our hands. As soon as book sales go down, let's roll out a new biblical text and a new study Bible and so forth. So we got to hold all of this accountable. There's an overwhelming number of translations that suffer from a strong basis of unfaithful group of translators. We have to hold this accountable. So what happens in this is that there's a number of groups that single-handedly try to create a new translation. And when they do, sometimes it's 1, 2, 3 people may be involved. So again, it's absolutely critical that we know what kind of translations we ought to use and which ones we need to stay away from, because that happened then, it's happening today. Let me highlight this for our listener. There are 3 major categories of Bible translations: word for word, which is called formal equivalence; thought for thought, which is dynamic equivalence; and paraphrase. Those are the 3 categories. word for word is a more literal translation. That's what we ought to be using of the original language. And it puts more onus on the reader to discover the intended meaning of the author, right? That's the joy of discovery in God's word, that you know that if there are layers that are intended there, they've been left unaltered. Those layers are still present. Then what happens is we move to a thought for thought. Then other translations come out, they're thought for thought based, where they're trying to help you with the translation, and sometimes you can lose some of that depth. But thought for thought presents the intended meaning of the author, which is the original. So the original audience would have understood some of that during the time the writing was originally created. So therefore, readers put a great deal more faith in the translators as they are trusting their interpretation. Okay, but in a paraphrase scenario, they're often written by a single author who translates the Bible in their own words, and sometimes not even using the original biblical language at all. So again, it's very important that we look to original language. I think that's critical, that even as we're translating to English from Hebrew and Greek, we have all these sources today. The Complutensian Polyglot is one of my favorites that was out there because it put them all side by side.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Here's a text in Hebrew, here's a text in Greek, and oh, by the way, here's a text in Latin, just in case you needed that one too. And then you put them all side by side so that when you put it alongside your English, you would be able to see how they came to that conclusion that they may use these three English words for that Greek word, and yet maintain the original meaning behind it without an author's interpretation of that. Author meaning the one who's transcribing it, right? So we got to be very careful on this. With all this relentless attack on God's holy word, we have to constantly hold every translation accountable. And let me just give you a list of quickly here of just some I would say avoid, right? All of our listeners, I would just say wholeheartedly avoid these. Number one, the Message. Number two, the Passion Translation. It's not even a translation. It's barely even a paraphrase. Stay away from it. Or the Living Bible, the Good News Translation, Contemporary English Version, the New World Translation, the Reader's Digest Bible, or even the New Living Translation. I would say stay away from those. If you really want to seriously study the Bible, they're not going to be able to help you understand the depth and meaning behind the original language. In addition, I would say that there's a number of major revisions to the New International Version. So while I grew up using that,
right,
and I know many of us did, it became a very popular way to translate the Bible. But I would just say that we need to be very, very cautious about using that. It's not one that we should use probably for our great diligent studies, right? So I would encourage more word-for-word translations. Here's just a few. The New American Standard, the English Standard, the New King James, even the original 1611 King James. Now they've got one called the Legacy Bible Translation that John MacArthur and his team put out. I have not yet seen it or read it yet. I've heard good things, and I know that given the reputation for John MacArthur and his team there at Master's Seminary, I suggest they probably have put a number of resources behind it to make sure it's a very good translation. We just have to be very cautious in this. I know we're out of time today. I hope what I've shared makes some sense, that basically what we have is how the Bible's name came to be. We've got these two competing libraries that were holding all of these scrolls. Major translations are going out as we see that the known world is speaking Greek. You now have the original Old Testament compiled in Alexandria, Egypt. Many scholars go there. They start also writing scrolls, sending them out to the churches. The apostles are sending out letters to the churches. Some of these were compiled then in Pergamus, then going out around the world. And these two libraries, unfortunately, would end up burning, being destroyed, and those scrolls wiped out. And praise be to God that by that point, thousands of copies of the biblical text had already gone out, and we'll get to that into a future episode of just how we know we still have the original text. As I mentioned, the Sinaiticus is dated to 325 AD. We even have ones way older than that. So we'll get to that in a future broadcast. So I want to thank you all for listening to engage in truth. This is just our fun little rambling as we're just going through the history of the Bible. I hope you've been encouraged and just saying, this is exciting stuff. Again, if you want to learn more about this, you can reach out to us at calvaryfountain.com. This is a ministry of Calvary Fellowship Fountain Valley Church. We have books on the history of the Bible that we love to send you, and you can go through this whole journey with us and read it at your own leisure and pace. Again, you can reach out at calvaryfountain.com, and you can listen to this broadcast and more. Services are on Sundays from 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. We have a service at 8 and at 10, and we've got groups that are meeting throughout the week, and we'd love to see you there. God bless you, my friends. Take care.